This is Unit 6, Lesson G, using solutions to write quadratic equations. Our objective for today is I can write a quadratic equation when given the solutions. So in the past, you guys have been given the equation and you've been responsible for finding the solution. Now you're going to be given the solutions to a quadratic equation. If you know the solutions, you can come up with the original equation. The nice thing is we only have two steps here. The first step is to write your solutions in parentheses. The main thing here, though, is you need to make sure to use the opposite sign when you go ahead and write those in parentheses. Your next step is then, once you have your parentheses, all we have to do is FOIL that out. So let's go ahead and take a look at our first example. Write the quadratic equation given the solutions. This tells me the solutions of my quadratic equation are x equals 0 and x equals 7. Write the quadratic equation. So let's make sure we go back, look at our first step. We need to write them in parentheses. So I'm going to go ahead and start by just setting up my parentheses. We know that since it's a quadratic equation, we have to set it equal to 0 because we're solving it. You guys have learned that previously in this chapter. Now, we also know that when we're writing binomials, we want to go ahead and start with our variable. So in both parentheses, I'm going to have x. Now, we just need to take the opposite sign of our two solutions. Well, our first one is 0, so that one doesn't really have an opposite sign. So I'm just going to go ahead and write x minus 0. And now we have a positive 7, so I'm going to write x minus 7. My next step is to go through and to FOIL this out. Well, x minus 0, we know that's just like saying x times x minus 7 equals 0. Now we go ahead and we distribute. So x times x, remember that gives me an x squared. X times negative 7 gives me a negative 7x equals 0. So we've FOILed it out, so when it asks us what is the quadratic equation, here we go. This is it. X squared minus 7x equals 0. You can check your answers by going through and by factoring this. So if you ever want to check, you can go ahead and factor, and you should end up with your original two solutions. Well, if we did, we could pull out a GCF of an x, and we'd be left with x minus 7 equals 0. And then you would set up your two equations. So x equals 0, x minus 7 equals 0. Here we would have to add the 7 to both sides, and we would get x equals positive 7. X equals 7 and x equals 0. That's exactly what we started with, so we know we did this correctly. The only other thing you want to watch out for is we know that we could have a GCF bigger than x. So if you were given this quadratic equation and we multiplied the whole thing by 2, so let's say we had 2 times x squared minus 7x equals 0. If we were to go through and distribute this, we would end up with 2x squared. Distribute your 2 to your negative 7x, we would get minus 14x equals 0. Could this also be our quadratic equation to give us the same exact two solutions? Well, if you go ahead and if you try and FOIL this out, or factor this out, we could go ahead and pull out a 2x, and then we're left with x minus 7 equals 0. You would set up your two equations to get 2x equals 0 and x minus 7 equals 0, and we would get our two solutions, x equals 0 and x equals 7. So what you could end up with is you could end up with a bigger GCF. So in this case, if this were a multiple choice question, either one of these answers would be acceptable. So let's go ahead, skip the U-tries. You guys are going to take care of those later on. And let's take a look at example 2. Write the quadratic equation given the solution. So our same directions as before. So our first step is to go ahead, set up our parentheses, and set our equation equal to 0. We fill in x since that's our variable, and now we just need to take the opposite of our solutions. So we have a positive 5, so I'm going to have x minus 5. We have a negative 2, so I'm going to have x plus 2. Now remember, our second step is to just go through and to FOIL. So my first terms are x times x, or x squared. My outer terms are x times a positive 2, so plus 2x. My inner terms are negative 5 times x, or minus 5x. And my last terms are negative 5 times 2, or negative 10, equals 0. Now from here, we know anytime after we FOIL, we have to combine like terms. So I get x squared, 2x minus 5x gives me a negative 3x minus 10 equals 0. So there we go, we have our equation. If you guys wanted to be sure this was correct, you could go through and factor it. And when you solved, you would end up with positive 5 and negative 2 as your solutions. Also recall is instead of using the FOIL method this way, you also could have gone through and set up your box. Either way, we would still end up with our same equation for our final answer. So let's go ahead, skip the next couple U-tries. We have those we'll take care in class tomorrow. So now we move to example 3. Once again, we have our same directions. The only difference now is if you take a look at this, we have a fraction as one of our solutions. We're going to go ahead. The solutions of a quadratic equation are x equals 1/2 and x equals 4. Write the quadratic equation. So we still start the exact same way. Start by setting up your two parentheses and set it equal to 0. X is my variable, so I fill that in, and we still need the opposite sign. So since I have a positive 1/2, I want x minus 1/2, and a positive 4, so I'm going to have x minus 4. Now, you guys know that we never have fractions in our parentheses when we factor. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of that fraction. Well, what we can do is we could clear the fraction by multiplying this first parenthesis by 2. When we do that, we'll end up with 2x minus 1. A shortcut, though, is anytime we have fractions and we're coming up with the quadratic equation, you can just go ahead and take that denominator and you can move it to the front of your first term. So my parenthesis now is going to become 2x minus, your denominator is no longer, so it'll just be our numerator, times x minus 4 equals 0. Now what we can do is we can go ahead and FOIL this out. My first term, so 2x times x will give me a 2x squared. My outer, 2x times negative 4 will give me a negative 8x. My inner, negative 1 times x will give me a negative 1x. And my last, negative 1 times a negative 4 will give me a positive 4 equals 0. Now we just go ahead and make sure we combine our like terms for our final answer. So we have 2x squared, negative 8x minus 1x gives me a minus 9x, plus 4 equals 0. If you were to go through and to factor this, you would end up with your two solutions of 1/2 and positive 4. So let's take a look at one more. If we look at part B of example 3, our solutions are 1/4 and negative 7. So go ahead, start by setting up your parentheses and set your equation equal to 0. X is my variable. I have a positive 1/4, so I'm going to subtract 1/4. I have a negative 7, so I'm going to go ahead and add 7. Remember that shortcut? 4 is in the denominator, so that's going to move to the front of my first term. So I have 4x minus 1 times x plus 7 equals 0. And now I'm going to go ahead and FOIL it out. I'm going to show you guys how to use the box method in case you forgot and you like that way better. But once again, remember, either method will work. So you go ahead and you set up your box. What we have in our first is 4x minus 1. And in my second, x plus 7. And now I'm just multiplying. 4x times x will give me a 4x squared. 4x times a positive 7 will give me a 28x. Negative 1 times x will give me a negative 1x. And lastly, negative 1 times positive 7 will give me a negative 7. Remember then we have to go ahead and loop together or combine our like terms. So for my final answer, I get 4x squared. 28x plus a negative 1x gives me plus 27x. Minus 7 equals 0. So here is my equation. That's my answer. And once again, we could go through and factor this. And when we solve, we would get positive 1/4 and negative 7 as our solutions. Okay, go ahead and skip that last U-try, those last couple. What you guys then need to do is, you know the drill by now. After watching this video, what can you do? What do you still not know how to do? And what are you going to do to help yourself?